Afternoon, Chris. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us about the climate challenge, where it's been and where it's going. And the first thing I want to do is just thank you for your leadership and the support of the climate challenge. When we applied for the climate challenge, we were in the midst of developing our climate plan, SA Climate Ready, and in the back of our mind was how are we going to implement this? Because it's going to take a tremendous amount of resources, and so the timing was perfect. And these past 2 years have been very, very productive. So I want to thank you and the entire NRDC and the Bloomberg Philanthropies team. I think my first question is, we're ending the 2-year program, and you've worked with 25 cities across the country, and what were some of the successes? And what are those things that really you think are great examples? And what do you think's next?
Sure. Thanks, Doug. It's good to be with you, and appreciate the work of you, of Mayor Nierenberg, and the entire team in San Antonio. And the commitment that the city, from the mayor to the city manager's office, to your office, and other departments have shown around the tremendous gravity of the situation that we face with respect to climate change, something that we know that in Texas you see and feel over so many days of the year, and how proactive you all have been in and around these issues. Well, first I think is good news. We've actually, with support from our partners at Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're going to continue to support our climate challenge cities actually through June of 2021. So we're really glad to continue to have the opportunity to work with you and your colleagues and the team in San Antonio. I would say, Doug, there are a few things that we have seen in terms of the learnings and successes of the challenge. First and foremost, we're running 25. We're in 25 different cities, and I think we're running 25 different challenges. And so I think one of the things that we have attempted to do with not only our team but our partners as well is to adapt what does proactive climate action look like in the variety of cities around the challenge. And so what makes sense in San Antonio may or may not make sense here in Chicago, where I live right now. So I think that's been one of the successes of the challenge, is really starting to adapt what we are seeing on a city by city basis. I think another thing that becomes important to us in our work is we're seeing a lot of cities really take on issues of transportation and mobility and center those issues not only in terms of their climate impact but also their equity impact. So how do we think about access to things like electric vehicles as we develop new modes of mobility? How do we ensure that all residents have access to those, to not only the assets that are associated with that, but the infrastructure that's connected to that as well? And importantly, how do we make sure that we're making the right types of investments in issues of transit and transportation alongside that, particularly at this time where we know that even though transit ridership is down around the country, ridership is down less in communities of color and low-income communities. These are where our essential workers live, and they still have to get to work, despite where we are in the pandemic. I would say the last thing is, and it's connected, I think, to issues of transportation, that the table that has to be established to think about proactive climate action has had to expand, and it's had to expand rapidly. I think if I think back to a lot of the work I did when I worked in Chicago city government, often when it gets to issues of renewable energy or energy efficiency, it becomes business versus environment. That's the kind of traditional battle lines you see of these fights. But communities around the country, and a lot of communities we work with, organizations who are very focused on equity are making sure that their voice is very much justifiably being heard. Groups who are thinking about issues of affordability and affordable housing. How are we thinking about issues of economic opportunity? So by its very nature, the table is having to expand. And it is not just an issue of, well, if the business community is on board, then we're good. It's really about how do we make sure that everyone who has a stake in these discussions has a sufficiency to the table.
Yeah, and I just to follow up on that, the whole equity issue is key. It's something that we have as an Office of Sustainability for quite a few years have been trying to embed in our work. The climate plan has equity as a key ethical framework, but the actual implementation of it is something else, and it's something that we're very cognizant it can't be a top-down approach. It really needs to be bringing those most impacted, those most vulnerable communities, those who've been disenfranchised for generations to the table, and not just help inform what we're doing, but really take some leadership roles in the decision making. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think that as local climate action continues and the nature of those discussions continue, part of the reason it becomes important is because the actions that are necessary to deal with the problem that we have, which is still a problem, and it's hard to even wrap your head or hands around it given everything that's going on in the world today. Climate change is still the most existential threat to humanity over the next century. And so we can't pretend like it's going away. But it also means that we all collectively have to up our game in terms of the nature and the work that we think about and what are the actions that we're having to take. We are having to start to push the envelope with respect to ambition in order to meet the necessity at hand. At the same time, it has to ultimately meet other issues and other goals of cities, be it the accessibility of jobs, be it understanding issues of economic opportunity, about thinking about this in the lens of racial justice, and understanding the historical inequities that, frankly, at times government has created, and how are we not just benign to those issues, but also proactive with respect to that. I think if I can actually turn the table to you, one of the things I'd be interested in hearing, you mentioned the city's climate action and adaptation plan, the CAP. Maybe talk more broadly about that, about some of the goals that you've seen in the CAP and what your office, your colleagues, and other departments have done to think about those strategies.
Council's adoption of the climate plan a year ago was a pretty huge milestone for this community. When I got to San Antonio, 7 years ago, nobody, it was not on the radar. Nobody was talking about it. So to get to the point where, council and the community rallied around, came up with a plan for, net carbon neutrality by 2050, as well as developing an adaptation plan was huge. I think something that you said really, resonated with me. The whole, environment versus business. What I've sometimes talked about is trade-offs, and we really tried to thread the needle with this plan. That it's not a one or the other. It's both. And so what the plan really does is it provides that high-level framework. It says, look, this is where we need to go. By 2050. These are all our interim targets. Looking at greening our energy supply, decarbonizing CPS energy, reducing our building energy consumption, reducing transportation consumption, increasing circular economy to make sure that we're minimizing what we're needlessly throwing away in landfills, preserving biodiversity, as well as a whole slate of emergency preparedness and adaptation strategies. Key to it though is making that business case, and that's I think one of our big challenges is climate change isn't getting better. Just because we passed the plan that a year ago we thought hit the mark, at 2050. What we're seeing now is that's not the case. The goal line's moving. Austin, released their draft plan, and I believe they're looking at 2040. So, how do we adapt quickly enough to the changing demand, while at the same time being able to bring all those diverse stakeholders along? And we believe that there is a business case. There's a business case for action now. We know that all of these strategies aren't just about climate change. It's about air quality, public health, mobility choices, great strong job base, bringing people out of poverty. So we don't want to get focused on just climate change as the issue. There's all these other issues, but at the end of the day, that's what it's about. If we don't implement this plan as part of the Texas community, the U.S. community, and the global community, those impacts we're going to experience are going to be devastating, and those are the costs that we want to avoid. So that's the conversation we're trying to have now. I think one of we talked a little bit about local governments, and local governments stepping up to the plate, but I know it's always a difficult question, and we know where the federal government has been, for the past 4 years. Your role it definitely allows you to your ear to what's going on at the federal level. I mean, what are your thoughts? What are the is there hope? Is there again, you don't have a crystal ball, but maybe if you could just talk a little bit about sort of that whole federal landscape, and not just where it is now, but really where it needs to go. That's the thing. I think local governments can only do so much when you start talking about major transformation of systems.
Sure. I think that regardless of the composition of Congress, regardless of as to who's in the White House, I think local climate action is critical for a few different reasons. First, if everyone recalls from their political science classes in high school and college, when you got to the federalism portion of the book, it talked about states being laboratories of policy innovation. Well, that's not really true anymore. It's cities. It's cities that are actually driving the innovation in and around this work. It's when you think about the work that San Antonio has done on electric vehicles, and then comparing that and looking at that versus with the work that we do with St. Louis, with Indianapolis, with St. Paul, that's what's actually driving the conversation. Then building up to work that can happen at the state and even potentially at the federal level. So that's one of the reasons I think that cities are important in this conversation. Secondly, the intersectionality between issues of climate connected to issues of affordability, economic justice, some of the things that we've talked about are not nice to haves at the city level. They're must haves, because as cities, as you talked about, Doug, the business case is an important part of that conversation. And cities inherently can't work in silos. President Obama, talked about how much he loves talking with cities and mayors, because you still got to pick up the trash and fill the potholes. And so balancing the essential services and great priorities that are within cities with the magnitude of what's necessary is really where the magic happens within cities, which I don't think you see as much on the state and federal level. I think where often cities are constrained and need that cooperation and connection with the federal government is around investment dollars, and linking the ambitious work back to dollars coming from federal departments and agencies, Congress, et cetera. And so often our advocacy at NRDC, our work with our consulting partners, delivery associates, thinks about it not only in terms of how do we broaden the lens within cities and how do we integrate climate action into a variety of departments. So it's not only it's making climate action wider within a city, but also deeper in terms of connecting it back to state and federal priorities. And ensuring that there's funding and support with respect to that. Connected to that, Doug, I'm curious, speaking of budgets, which for department heads I know are always fun and easy conversations. We're definitely in a time of austerity now. Talk to me a little bit about how you and your colleagues have thought about prioritization in a really tough economic cycle.
Yeah, and this past year's budget was a nail biter. I think I've been doing this for 16 years now. Working with local government, and it's always tough. It's always trade-offs. But the work of our city manager, mayor, and council was pretty incredible. Just taking a look at the unprecedented impact. And so, where I was as department director was just hoping for the best. It was very much out of our control. And I think the hope was that the work that our office does would be seen as a value. Would be seen as something that really is a core component of our organization, and it was, and I think we came out in good shape. Now next year is going to be different. I think if we don't come out of this, I think every city department is going to be facing the same issues. But in terms of what we focus on and how we prioritize, I think one of our key responsibilities, and I think one of our core job functions as a department is managing the city's energy efficiency fund. I mean, that's a very simple thing for city leaders to understand. It's taking an annual pot of money that was established back in 2011 to undertake energy efficiency improvements in city facilities, and then we capture those dollars avoided, and it basically circles back into the fund. That's a no-brainer. And so that's something that we really continue to focus on. And I think everything else is about efficiency. You mentioned the work that we're doing with electric vehicles. We're working on with a private installer on looking at how we install publicly accessible charging infrastructure on city-owned parking lots and garages, and it's being designed in a way where it's ideally cost neutral to the city. When we're updating our current fleet procurement policy, making sure that when we, depending on the vehicle class, we're defaulting to an electric vehicle because its operating costs are so much lower than an ICE vehicle. So everything that we're trying to prioritize right now is really based upon that return on investment. That this is about it is about climate, it is about sustainability, but from a business sense, it's about the economics. And then the last thing I'll mention is our big challenge, I think, as a community and as an organization is really understanding what this climate issue is. I think if you were to pick somebody off the street now, if you were to pick a city employee, there's a good shot that they're not going to understand or even know about this. And so, a lot of our work that's been going on and it's going to continue to go on is really about engaging and educating not just our community but our city organization, from the executives on down to the people in the front line, just to understand what we're up against, why we need to do this, and what their role is. So, I want to get back a little bit to these 25 cities. I mean, because it's a pretty unprecedented initiatives that you've really been keenly involved in. And I remember when the challenge was in its infancy, there weren't 25 cities. I think if I remember, there were maybe 20 cities. So, and there was such a demand and so much opportunity that at the last minute it was expanded to bring more cities. And so as you had mentioned, every city is different, and everybody's approach to this is a little different. So, are there some really unique examples? I mean, we all, and just so people understand, when cities applied for this, there was a list of strategies we all had to work on. I mean, there was basically we're all working on these strategies in buildings, these strategies in transportation, but there was room for other efforts. I'm wondering, are there 2 or 3 really interesting, not just necessarily programs, but approaches that you think are worth highlighting for people watching this?
Yeah, I think I would point to a few different things that we've seen, and you're right. So I think one of the things that the Bloomberg Philanthropy saw in as cities were applying, I was actually on the other end of this as an applicant in the city when I was with the city of Chicago. But I do think we're seeing some really cool initiatives happen, and I think a lot of them go to issues of engagement and how, particularly in a time of COVID, how cities are trying to be more proactive around thinking through engagement. So, so many of our initiatives, because of the transformational nature of them, cities have had to, we knew how they broaden the spectrum of who they engage on these issues was going to be paramount, particularly focusing on low-income communities, communities of color, and organizations that maybe historically have not been a part of that conversation. And so, what we've seen are examples like in Boston, who have been they've been working on working on building performance standards. So thinking about how they drive down energy use, which has some similarities to the work I know San Antonio's been doing around benchmarking. So they were very focused on connecting with low-income communities during the pandemic, and so they were in situations where they were, our community partners were setting up hotspots and providing loaner iPads to folks so they could fill out surveys and provide other information that was relevant and important to their communities as they thought about building policy. Albuquerque has been working on their broader climate plan with a whole set of initiatives designed around connecting with low-income communities. And because of the pandemic, obviously they weren't able to connect with them. So they actually just started mailing out postcards. They went super lo-fi and said, well, what if we were just connect with folks with postcards? But here's a postcard. Here's some information. That also gets around the digital divide, which we know is real and rampant in many of our cities and many of our communities. Doug, I know that VIA has really kind of leaned in on telephone town hall to talk about issues and concerns and safety around the VIA transportation system and how to ensure that folks understand how not only is VIA open and operating, but why transportation and transit are so important in people's lives. At the end, it's all something about cities. Like we talked about earlier, cities got jobs to do, and they can't wait. You want to get a group of mayors together, you get a group of potentially the most impatient people on the face of the planet. And so the need to move quickly and adapt quickly has really seen where cities have shined. It's been tough. Obviously, cities are not places where telework or remote work is used that often. But credit Doug to you and so many of the city employees that we work with around the country. Who have adapted on the fly and have still focused on how to deliver for their respective communities. It's been admirable to watch, and I've been far from envious, far from not being envious of not having to be in that position from my previous days in Chicago City Hall. Let's talk a little bit about Texas. So I know it will shock everyone on this call that Texas is an oil and gas state. So the conversations around energy efficiency, the conversations around renewable energy can be delicate and very real in the lives of people who work in those industries, your neighbors, your friends, whose livelihood may be connected to that. So talk to me about how you, your team, the mayor, the city manager, et cetera, have thought about bringing in those perspectives and bringing in those voices, and how you've managed to ensure that they have a seat at the table as well, while still focused on pushing really important climate action.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I'll never forget when the mayor had been asked by a reporter about whether or not our plan was aggressive enough, and his response was, we're a city that's at the doorstep of some of the largest, shale plays, for natural gas in the country, and so, what we had to do through the entire process was to make sure that we were reaching out to the oil and gas industry. Some of our largest employers are oil and gas, and so sitting down with them, hearing their concerns. I think that the one great thing through the planning process was none of them started with "we don't believe this," we don't believe in climate change. We should. That wasn't the issue. I think it was more making sure that there was a clear recognition of the role, and we have lots of conversations, as in this field about the whole idea of, natural gas as a transition fuel. I think that makes a lot of people, uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, we're still using natural gas, and those are a lot of jobs. And so, where we are right now is we just established two advisory committees, council approved. There's a woman from the oil and gas organization who's going to be the voice at the table. I think the way the conversation needs to go forward is really looking at where we're headed. And one of the things I really like is the conversation that's happening over in Houston, that it's not about is a transition going to happen. It is happening, and Houston's talking point now is, if we want to remain the energy capital of the world, we need to transition. We need to start figuring out how we start moving over into renewables. And in San Antonio's companies are a little different than BP and Shell, but we need to figure out what the plan is going forward. That acknowledging that markets are shifting, acknowledging that consumer demand is changing, and we do want to keep these jobs. So how do we work with oil and gas locally to figure out what's the best way to shift the business model to make sure that if things keep going the way they're going, those jobs just disappear, but that they're transitioned to a cleaner future. So I think it's going to be a very robust conversation over the years. When we start talking about some work that we've seen out in California. I believe it's Berkeley that basically said all new construction, you can't have natural gas, it's all got to be electrified. Those will be difficult conversations because it's going to have a direct impact on local business. But I think it gets back to that business case, showing the value, and showing that there is a possible pathway to ensure that these organizations and these businesses adapt to what the future holds. Um, I know we're coming close to the end of our time. One of the things I just wanted to follow up on that you had touched on, it's the whole COVID thing. I mean, we had a really great head of steam. 2 years developing this plan. Got to a good level of consensus. Council passed it, and then boom, things sort of stalled. And it was interesting to hear that cities are finding their way, around this new landscape. One of the things that we've been trying to do is really to explain to the community and city leaders the connection between working on climate and addressing COVID-19, the recession, and systemic racism. And I'm just wondering, if you have any, I'm sure, any examples of other cities that are part of the challenge that are having a similar conversation, and if there's any, good examples or any, anything that we could learn from what other cities are doing.
Sure. I think, COVID ultimately has, more than anything, exposed the structural gap that exists in our economic and public health system today, which is why Blacks and Latinx communities are far more likely to have high incidences of hospitalizations and deaths as a result of COVID-19 versus white communities. Why you're seeing the impacts of, frankly, of things like fossil fuels, their impact on air quality, and how that has now come back to haunt us because of the comorbidities of things like asthma, things like COPD, and how they're increasing severe adverse reactions or, unfortunately, deaths as it pertains to COVID-19. And it also has exposed, at times, the soft underbelly of how we are supporting those communities at the same time, be it in terms of healthcare access, the ability to bounce back in jobs, which is why you're seeing the recession or potentially depression that we're in right now. And although you're seeing certain communities and certain folks bounce back, particularly where you're seeing low-income and workers and workers of color, and particularly in things like retail, hospitality, restaurants, they're not bouncing back as well. I think one of the examples I would provide, I think, is San Antonio, is thinking about how do we connect new opportunities around workforce development to transit and other systems to kind of create that lifelong opportunities for learning, which I think is going to be critically important. The phrase "build back better" is out there a lot. I think that we're in support of that, but part of the question still is, what are we building back to? And being clear that if all we're doing is just building back an equitable system, that's not necessarily helpful. And what it means is that we're just buying time until the next pandemic, until the next shock to a city. And it may not be in every city like COVID-19. It could be a natural disaster. It could be the loss of a major company or a major industry. And so how are cities, thinking about diversification? How are cities thinking about issues of air quality? Not only the impact historically air quality has, but as car traffic has come down, how are we thinking about how we move and the issues connected to that? So I think we've seen more and more cities think about issues of job training, workforce development, and how do we use this as an opportunity to create the next round of 21st century jobs at good wages that are accessible to folks and who may not necessarily have a college education. Another component that goes to this is how we move and how we get around cities, and how we're seeing significant increases in biking and walking. It's hard to find a bike in America, it feels like, right now. And so how do we essentially kind of lock that in? And as cities have thought about different ways of using their roads, that roads don't just have to be used for cars. They can be used for people to walk. They can be used for people to bike. They can be used for people to have meals or do retail. And so reconceptualizing that, how do we kind of lock in some of those gains? I spent 7 years working for Rahm Emanuel, and he was apt to say, never let a crisis go to waste. And so, thinking, kind of throwing a bit of the book out, and actually thinking about some of these solutions and actions on the ground up, and that the goal does not have to be that to shift in reverse and just go back to how things were. It's okay to actually reconceptualize how we move, how we work, and how we think about both the disadvantages and benefits of good policy and good climate action, and make sure that those are provided fairly around. And I know we're getting close to time. I'd be curious, Doug, to just assuming 2021 happens, let's tell me about what you're focused on thinking about in 2021.
Yeah, and I think this sort of gets back to the first thing that you said in the beginning regarding the 6-month extension of the challenge. When we first signed up for the challenge and were making the commitments, I knew in the back of my mind that 2 years wasn't going to do it. These are big commitments. So for us, I think it's completing some of the things that we've been working on for the past couple of years. We've been working with CPS Energy for quite some time on a procurement process for 100% renewable for the municipal organization, getting that RFP out on the street. Finalizing our green fleet procurement policy, so that we have a clear policy on that really outlines we are buying the most efficient vehicles, we are electrifying our fleet as quickly as possible. Would love to see the conversations that we've been having in the community for the past year and a half around benchmarking and disclosure and EV and solar readiness, get that to a point of resolution where all the different stakeholders come together with something that we can bring to council, where we all understand, as you had referenced before, that cost benefit. Yes, all these actions that we need to take on climate have some sort of cost to them, but there's a lot of benefit. And so I think really getting those initiatives forward. And then really one of the biggest thing that we would really like to crack next year is really learning from and emulating some of the work of our Office of Equity, who has, with painstaking work for the past few years, have been able to integrate equity into the city's budgeting process, where departments are really being tasked with understanding the equity implications of their decision making. And we'd like to pilot something like that for next year's budget, where we're a $1 billion organization. That's a lot of resources. And to your point, not only how we make sure that those dollars are being invested to move us forward, but we're not sliding back on our climate commitments. So I think those, and there's countless others, but those are really some of the big priorities. But we'll leave it there. I want to thank you for again for all your time and your not just your commitment to the challenge, but just your commitment to your work in the field for quite a long time. Always look at what's going on in Chicago and been very impressed. And I look forward to working with you and your team over the next 6 months.
Yeah, Doug, I can't thank you, Julia, and the full team in the Office of Environment and Sustainability enough for the commitment that you've made, the commitment of other departments and agencies, TCI, the city manager's office, and obviously Mayor Nierenberg, who's been very much a champion and one of our loudest and most supportive mayors. in or around these issues as well. So we'll continue to work together.
Great. Thanks so much.